A massive fire rages, illuminating the night sky. Cotton bales, the white gold of Mississippi, burn with an impossible fury. Through the thick, choking smoke, a lone figure moves with calm deliberation, his silhouette framed against the inferno. He is supposed to be guarding this wealth, but instead, he is watching it burn, a grim satisfaction on his face. He has just struck a blow against the man who owns his body, but not his spirit. He doesn't know if his wife, his only reason for living, has managed to escape in the chaos, or if the baying of the hounds will soon be on his trail. All he knows is that freedom is a fire he must walk through. As he turns from the blaze, leaving his old life to be consumed by the flames, one question hangs in the smoky air. Can a man truly erase his past and be reborn from the ashes? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The night was a smothering blanket thrown over Oakwood Plantation, here, just outside Natchez, Mississippi, in the year of our Lord 1834. The air itself felt heavy, weighted down with the oppressive humidity of late summer and the sweet, cloying scent of raw cotton. It was a smell Jeremiah Carter had come to loathe, the perfume of stolen labor and broken lives. In the cotton storage yard, hundreds of tightly packed bales were stacked like small, pale hills under the indifferent gaze of a slivered moon. They represented a fortune, the entire season's yield, waiting to be shipped down the river to the hungry mills of the world. And Jeremiah was its guardian. He stood in the profound silence, a silence that was not peaceful but pregnant with unspoken suffering. It was broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant whispery rustle of the Mississippi River, a constant murmur of a freedom that felt a world away. Jeremiah was in his late 20s, a man forged strong by years of relentless, forced labor. His shoulders were broad, his arms corded with muscle, but it was his eyes that set him apart. They were intelligent, watchful, and missed nothing, holding a depth of thought that the masters of Oakwood preferred not to see in their property. In his calloused hands he held a heavy wooden club, its surface worn smooth by the grip of men before him. It was the symbol of his duty as a night guard, a position of supposed trust that felt more like a gilded leash, a way to make one slave complicit in the guarding of another's chains. His gaze swept over the yard. Each bale of cotton was a monument. He saw not just packed fiber, but the sweat of the men and women who had planted the seeds, the blood from fingers pricked raw during the harvest, the tears shed in the crushing heat of the gin house. He felt the weight of his ancestors' chains in the very marrow of his bones, a cold, heavy inheritance that permeated the air of the slave quarters and clung to them like the damp Mississippi fog. It was a hopelessness so profound it had its own texture, a gritty film that coated every moment of every day. He hated the cotton, hated the soft white fibers with a passion that burned hotter than any sun. It was the source of their misery, the physical manifestation of their bondage. As he made his slow, deliberate circuit, his eyes caught on something new. A recent shipment, brought in from the fields at dusk, had been stacked with unusual carelessness. The bales were crammed together in the center of the yard, forming a tight, haphazard maze of highly flammable material. There were no fire breaks, no clear paths between the stacks. His gaze drifted upward, noting the brittle, dry leaves on the oak trees that bordered the yard, a testament to the long, rainless weeks. He licked his finger and held it to the air, feeling the direction of the prevailing wind, a steady breeze blowing from the south, directly toward the main house and the rest of the plantation. A thought, formless and terrifying, a seed of a desperate idea, began to germinate in the fertile soil of his mind. It was a flicker of heat in the cold darkness of his thoughts, a possibility so audacious it made his heart hammer against his ribs. He pushed it down, his hand tightening on the club. Such thoughts were dangerous. Such thoughts were death. The crunch of heavy boots on the packed earth announced the arrival of Overseer Finch. The man moved with an arrogant swagger, his cruelty etched into the deep lines that bracketed his thin mouth and radiated from the corners of his pale, cold eyes. Finch made his nightly rounds with a theatrical air of importance, his presence a constant, unpredictable threat. He thrived on fear, cultivating it as carefully as the master cultivated his cotton. He stopped a few feet from Jeremiah, his eyes scanning the yard with a proprietary glare. He was looking for an excuse, a minor infraction upon which to hang his nightly dose of casual brutality. His eyes landed on a single bale, tilted at a slight angle, its edge protruding a few inches beyond the neat line of the stack. "You think you're better than the field hands, Carter?" Finch's voice was a low, gravelly drawl, thick with menace. "Standing here with your club? This wood is the only thing keepin' you from a whip, you remember that." He kicked the corner of the offending bale with the toe of his boot. "This cotton is worth more than 10 of you." Jeremiah remained silent. He had learned long ago that silence was his only armor. He kept his face a mask of dull compliance, his eyes fixed on a point just past Finch's shoulder. But inside, a storm was raging. The casual dehumanization, the easy equation of his life against a bale of plant fiber, sent a surge of white-hot fury through him. His knuckles were bone-white where he gripped the club, the wood groaning faintly under the pressure. He could feel the phantom sting of the lash on his back, a memory passed down through blood and story. He could smell the sweat and fear of the punishment shed, could hear the pleas for mercy that were never answered. Finch's words were not just an insult. They were a distillation of their entire existence. They were worth less than the crop they were forced to grow. Finch smirked, satisfied with the rigid stillness he had imposed on the guard. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Jeremiah's feet, a final act of contempt, before turning and continuing his rounds, his footsteps receding into the oppressive quiet. The encounter, though brief, was a catalyst. It was the flint striking the steel in Jeremiah's soul, the abstract, dangerous idea of rebellion, the formless seed that had taken root only moments before, now crystallized into a concrete, unshakable resolve. He would not just run, he would not just slip away into the night like a thief. He would leave a message. He would destroy the source of his master's wealth, the very thing Finch had declared more valuable than his life. The fire would be his declaration of independence. It would be his cover, his chaos, his final blistering word in a conversation he was never allowed to have. The decision settled in him, not with heat, but with a chilling, absolute calm. Just before the false dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and gray, Jeremiah slipped away from his post. He moved like a shadow through the familiar pathways of the plantation, his bare feet making no sound on the cool earth. His destination was a hidden corner behind the smokehouse, a small, secluded spot shielded from view by a thicket of overgrown jasmine. She was already there, a silhouette against the rough-hewn wood of the smokehouse wall. Elara, his wife. She was as resourceful as he was, and she shared his burning fire, though she masked it with a quiet, unshakable grace that was a constant source of his own strength. Their meetings were always brief, stolen moments in a life that was not their own, and their words were often coded, a private language of hope and survival. He reached for her, and their hands clasped in the darkness. Her touch was his anchor, the one grounding force in a world designed to tear him apart. He looked into her eyes and saw the reflection of his own exhaustion, the deep, weary lines that spoke of endless labor and constant fear. He knew, with a certainty that ached in his chest, that he could not let her face another harvest season. He could not watch the light in her eyes dim a little more each day. "The river fog is coming in thick these nights," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "A good night for a long walk." Elara's grip tightened on his hand. She understood immediately. Her gaze flickered for a moment toward the dark line of the woods that bordered the plantation. "A walk would be good," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor he could feel in her fingers. "But the path is dangerous. You can't get lost in the dark." "I've been marking the path," he said, his voice low and urgent. He brought her hand to his lips, a gesture of desperate tenderness. "With stones, you just have to look for the signs. North Star is the only guide you need after the river." He was giving her the first part of the plan, a plan he had been meticulously crafting in the secret corners of his mind for weeks. It was not just his own escape he was plotting, but a coordinated flight. He would create the diversion, a spectacle of fire and chaos so grand it would draw every eye, every able body on the plantation. And in that chaos, she would slip away. He had laid the groundwork, a trail of subtle markers that only she would recognize, leading her north toward the river and the promise of freedom. The stakes of his plan were suddenly immense, magnified 1,000 times over. His success was not just for his own liberation, but for hers. If he failed, they would both be lost. They stood together for a moment longer, two souls clinging to each other in the encroaching dawn, their shared secret a fragile, terrifying, and beautiful thing. It was a promise of a future they could barely imagine, a future that would have to be purchased with fire. The following day, Jeremiah moved through his assigned tasks with a bifurcated consciousness. On the surface, he was the same compliant slave, his movements measured and his eyes downcast. But beneath that placid exterior, a new self was operating, a creature of pure, cold purpose. The world, once a dull, monotonous backdrop to a life of unending labor, had become sharp and crystalline with detail, every sight and sound pregnant with meaning, either as a threat or an opportunity. He was a ghost moving through his own life, his true intentions hidden behind the familiar mask of obedience he had worn since birth. His duties took him near the blacksmith shed, a place of scorching heat and the percussive, rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil, a sound that was as much a part of oakwood as the rustle of cane leaves. While ostensibly gathering scrap wood for the kitchen fires, his eyes, quick and furtive, scanned the refuse pile outside the shed's gaping maw. Amongst the discarded metal shavings and bits of charcoal, he saw it, a small, sharp-edged piece of flint, deemed too small for the blacksmith's use, lay next to a chipped piece of steel from a broken file. His heart gave a single, powerful thud against his ribs. To anyone else, it was worthless trash. To Jeremiah, it was the key to a new world. Feigning a stumble over an exposed root, he bent down, his body momentarily shielding his actions from view. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed around the stones. They felt impossibly heavy in his palm, dense with the weight of his decision. He secreted them away in a small, deliberate tear he had made in the lining of his coarse linen trousers. The act was small, almost insignificant, yet it felt as momentous as shifting a mountain. Later, his work took him to the kitchens, a domain of sweltering heat and a cacophony of smells, from rendering lard to baking bread. While the head cook was berating a young girl for spilling a measure of flour, Jeremiah's gaze swept the room. He found what he was looking for: a pile of discarded rags in a dark corner, destined for the lye soap vat. Some were soaked in grease from cleaning the great roasting spit, others stiff with spilled cooking oil. They were perfect tinder. He watched the flow of movement in the room, waiting for the precise moment of distraction. When it came, he moved with a fluid swiftness, grabbing a tight bundle of the most promising rags. He stuffed them under his thin shirt, the greasy fabric feeling cold and alien against the heat of his skin. Each acquisition, each stolen component of his plan, was a small, silent victory. A jolt of mingled terror and exhilarating purpose shot through his veins with every successful act of subterfuge. This was the first time in his entire life he had felt truly in control of his own destiny, the master of a fate he was shaping with his own two hands, a fate that did not belong to Alistair Dubois. He spent the remainder of the day in this state of heightened perception, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He tracked the patrol schedules of the overseers, noting the predictable patterns, the moments of distraction when they would stop to share a swig of whiskey, the blind spots in their routes where a man could disappear from sight for a few crucial, unobserved minutes. He was no longer just a slave, a piece of property. He was a strategist, a general planning a war with an army of one, and the battlefield was the very plantation that had been his prison. The confrontation he had been dreading, yet knew was inevitable, came in the late afternoon, in the suffocating, shimmering heat of the cotton fields. Old Ben, a man whose age was impossible to guess but was etched in the deep, intricate map of wrinkles on his face, was a fixture at Oakwood. His back was permanently stooped from a lifetime of bending to the earth. But his eyes, though often clouded with sorrow, held a deep and penetrating wisdom. He had seen it all. He had seen uprisings on other plantations, had witnessed the brutal, systematic retribution that always followed, the floggings that left men broken, the hot iron of the branding, the finality of the sales that tore families apart as if they were nothing more than bolts of cloth. He had learned that survival for the community was a delicate and bitter calculus of compliance, and he had been watching Jeremiah. He saw the new, rigid tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, the unnatural stillness that had replaced his usual mask of weary endurance. Ben cornered him at the edge of the field, near a line of cypress trees, their gnarled roots digging into the earth like ancient fingers. They were far enough from the driver's ever-present whip that their words would be carried away by the breeze. "Boy," Ben's voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across hard, sun-baked ground. I see that look in your eye. I seen it before. On my brother, right before they sold him south to the sugar fields. On a woman from the Miller place, before she ran for the swamp and the dogs found her. It's the look of a man about to bring a storm down on all of us. He paused, his gaze heavy with the ghosts of his memories. Whatever you're thinking, you remember it ain't just your back that'll feel the lash. It's everyone's. It's Ilara's. The mention of her name was a physical blow, and Jeremiah flinched. He stopped his work, resting his heavy hoe on the ground. He looked at the old man, at the deep lines of resignation carved into his face, and felt not anger, but a profound, aching sadness. This was what the system did. It turned the wise to cowards and the brave to fools. And I see the look in yours, old Ben. Jeremiah's voice was low, but it carried a new hard edge that made the old man's eyes widen slightly. The look of a man who has forgotten what it feels like to stand up straight. We die a little every day here. They chip away at us, piece by piece, with the whip, with the heat, with the knowledge that our children are not our own. They leave us a husk. I'd rather die all at once, on my feet, than live a long life on my knees. Risen, Ben shook his head slowly, a gesture of deep, ingrained sorrow that went beyond disagreement. Freedom ain't a fire you can burn your way to, boy. It's a river you gotta cross, quiet-like, in the dark. You make a big noise, and the hunters will come for everyone. Maybe, Jeremiah said, turning his gaze back toward the distant storage yard, a shimmering mirage of white in the afternoon heat. But sometimes, the river is on the other side of the fire. The conversation ended there, leaving a cold weight in the air between them. Ben's fear was a tangible thing, the collective terror of generations who knew the price of defiance. Jeremiah had to confront the undeniable truth in the old man's words, the very real possibility that his actions could bring unimaginable suffering down upon the people he was leaving behind. But it did not deter him. It solidified his belief that a slow, certain death in bondage was no different from a quick, uncertain one in the pursuit of something more. The storm Ben feared was coming, and Jeremiah would be its eye, its calm, deliberate center. Under the pretense of foraging for edible roots and herbs in the woods bordering the plantation, Jeremiah began the most critical part of his preparation. This was not an act of gathering, but an act of love and foresight, a lifeline spun from the materials of the forest. He was marking the path for Ilara. They were signs they had devised long ago, in stolen moments of whispered hope, a secret language of their own. He moved with a quiet purpose, his senses on high alert. Near the creek that she would have to cross, he found a young sycamore and broke one of its lower branches, leaving it hanging at an unnatural angle, a stark white wound against the green foliage. Further on, where the path forked, he created a small, seemingly accidental stack of 3 flat stones, one atop the other, a tiny cairn of hope. His most intricate marker was a carving in the rough bark of a massive oak tree. To an untrained eye, it would look like a natural scar, a place where lightning had once grazed the trunk. But Ilara would recognize the shape, a subtle curve that mimicked the swooping flight of a marsh hawk, a bird they had often watched together. With each mark he made, he imagined her finding it. He pictured her hand tracing the broken branch, her eyes spotting the stones in the dappled sunlight, her fingers recognizing the familiar shape in the bark. He was weaving a trail for her, a thread to lead her out of the labyrinth of their enslavement. A sharp pang of fear, cold and piercing, shot through him at the thought of her making this journey alone, of the thousand dangers that lurked in the swamps and forests, both animal and human. But his faith in her strength, in her resourcefulness, was absolute. She was not a fragile flower. She was a reed, slender but unbreakable, capable of bending in the wind without snapping. This path he was creating was more than a series of directions. It was a testament to that faith. It was a promise that he was thinking of her, that his plan was not just for himself, but for them. The final sunset came, painting the western sky in violent hues of orange, purple, and blood red. A celestial fire that foreshadowed the earthly one to come. In the slave quarters, the usual evening hum of exhaustion and quiet conversation seemed muted, tense, as if the very air knew that the fragile equilibrium of their world was about to break. Jeremiah and Elara sat together outside their small, windowless cabin, sharing a final meal of corn mush and salted pork. They barely spoke. Words were inadequate for what lay between them. Their silence was heavy with meaning, a tapestry woven from threads of fear, love, fierce determination, and a final desperate goodbye. He watched her, committing every detail of her face to memory, the way a stray curl of her hair caught the last light of the sun, the proud set of her jaw, the deep, soulful light in her eyes. This image of her would be his talisman, the one sacred thing he would carry with him into the dark road ahead. When the meal was done, and the sky had deepened to a star-pricked indigo, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a small, tightly wrapped pouch he had made from a piece of scrap leather. He pressed it into her hand. Her fingers closed around it, and she looked at him with a question in her eyes. "It's not much," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A piece of dried meat, and a bone, sharpened to a point." It was a meager provision, a pathetic offering against the trials she would face, but it was all he had to give, a tangible piece of his care for her. It was a weapon. It was sustenance. It was a promise. She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and tucked the pouch into the bodice of her dress. They shared one last look, a look that conveyed everything that could not be said. It was a vow, a prayer, a final silent confirmation of their shared purpose. Then, as the horn sounded for the final lockdown of the quarters, he stood up. It was time to go to his post. It was time to light the fire. This was their final moment together before the world they knew was consumed by flames. The night deepened, swallowing the last vestiges of twilight. The moon, which had offered a sliver of indifferent light earlier, had now retreated entirely behind a thick, suffocating blanket of clouds, plunging the world into a profound and absolute darkness. In the cotton storage yard, Jeremiah waited. He was a statue carved from shadow, his stillness a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of his own heart. He waited for the familiar, heavy tread of Overseer Finch to complete his first round, waited for the sound of the man's shack door closing, a sound that signaled a brief reprieve, a window of opportunity. The moment the faint click echoed across the yard, Jeremiah moved. He did not run. He flowed through the narrow canyons between the cotton bales, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. He moved with a silent, deadly grace he had not known he possessed. His destination the very heart of the tightly packed maze, the place where the carelessly stacked bales were most vulnerable. Here, in the center of his master's wealth, he knelt. The air was thick with the cloying scent of the cotton, a smell that had defined his entire existence. Tonight, he would give it a new scent, the scent of purification, of rebellion. From the torn lining of his trousers, he retrieved his treasures, the small, sharp piece of flint and the chipped shard of steel. His hands trembled as he brought them out. But it was not a tremor of fear. It was the vibration of a lifetime of suppressed rage finally being unleashed. A raw, electric adrenaline that sharpened his senses and focused his mind to a single, brilliant point. He pulled the bundle of oil, soaked rags from beneath his shirt, their greasy texture a promise of the inferno to come. He positioned a corner of the driest rag against the flint. He took a breath, the humid Mississippi air filling his lungs for the last time as Jeremiah Carter, slave of Oakwood. He struck the steel against the flint, a pathetic scrape, a shower of impotent sparks that died in the oppressive darkness. He adjusted his grip, his knuckles white. He struck again, harder this time. A sharp, grating sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. A single, defiant spark leaped from the stone. It was a tiny thing, a miniature sun that lived for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. It found the oil, soaked fibers of the rag. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke curled upwards. A ghostly finger pointing toward the heavens. A tiny orange ember glowed at its base, pulsing like a malevolent heart. Jeremiah held his breath, nurturing the fragile creation with his stillness. The ember grew, and with a soft, hungry hiss, a small flame licked at the edge of the rag. It was no bigger than his thumb, a delicate, dancing thing, yet it held a universe of defiance. He watched, mesmerized, as it tasted the fuel, its color deepening from a pale orange to a rich, vibrant yellow. This was the point of no return. The man who had knelt in the darkness was gone, consumed by that first flicker of fire. In his place was something new, an agent of chaos, an instrument of liberation, his spirit forged in the crucible of this first, sacred spark. The fire did not grow, it exploded. The small, hungry mouth of the flame became a ravenous maw. It devoured the oil, soaked rag in seconds, and leaped with an eager roar to the nearest bale of cotton. The tightly packed fibers, dried to tinder by the long, hot summer, ignited with a terrifying whoosh. What had been a single manageable flame became a wall of fire in the space of a few heartbeats. The conflagration spread with a speed that defied belief. Far faster than even Jeremiah had anticipated, a gust of wind, the same southern breeze he had noted earlier, swept through the yard, catching the embers and flinging them like fiery seeds onto the surrounding bales. One stack ignited, then another, and another, a chain reaction of incandescent fury. The night was not just illuminated, it was violently torn asunder. A hellish, pulsating orange glow replaced the darkness, turning the underside of the clouds into a roiling, fiery ceiling. The entire storage yard was transformed into a roaring inferno, a monstrous, living entity of heat and light. The sound was overwhelming, a deafening roar that drowned out the chirping of the crickets and the distant murmur of the river. It was the sound of a giant beast waking from a long slumber, its voice a symphony of destruction. The crackling and popping of the burning cotton bales was like a fusillade of gunshots, punctuated by the deeper groaning collapse of the stacks as their structural integrity failed. The heat was a physical blow, a suffocating wave that drove the air from the lungs and seared the skin. The smell was acrid and choking, a nauseating combination of burning plant fiber, scorched earth, and the melting tar used to wrap the bales. Flames, monstrous and unstoppable, leaped dozens of feet into the air, their fiery tongues licking at the night sky. They danced and writhed, a monstrous ballet of liberation, consuming the white gold of Mississippi and turning it into a mountain of black, worthless ash. Across the plantation, the first shouts of alarm began to ring out, thin cries of terror against the overwhelming roar of the fire. The spectacle of destruction was complete, a beacon of rebellion burning bright against the dark canvas of the night. In the chaos that erupted, Jeremiah did not flee. Panic was a luxury he could not afford, while others began to run from their cabins, their faces illuminated by the terrifying glow. He moved with a chilling and deliberate purpose. His eyes scanned the edge of the quarters, searching for one specific shadow among the many. And then he saw her, a fleeting, graceful shape, moving not toward the fire, but away from it. Elara. She slipped from the door of their cabin, a small bundle clutched in her hand, and melted into the deeper darkness at the edge of the woods, just as they had planned. A wave of profound relief, so powerful it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. The first, most important part of his gamble had paid off. She was on her way. The knowledge gave him a new, cold strength. Now, the sounds of alarm were everywhere. Men, both enslaved and free, poured from the cabins and the overseers' shacks, their shouts a confused babble of fear and anger. Some ran towards the fire with useless wooden buckets, their efforts laughably futile against the raging inferno. From his small shack near the yard, Overseer Finch burst forth, a bullwhip already coiled in his hand, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He bellowed orders that were swallowed by the roar of the flames, his authority incinerated by the sheer scale of the disaster. His furious eyes scanned the chaos, and then they found Jeremiah. He was not running, not fighting the fire, not shouting. He was standing just outside the main ring of heat, his heavy wooden club held loosely in one hand, watching the fortune of Alistair Dubois turn to smoke. Finch's face contorted with a new, specific fury. "Carter!" he roared, his voice cracking with rage as he charged forward. "You lazy dog! Get a bucket!" "What are you doing?" Finch closed the distance between them, his whip raised, his intention clear. He expected Jeremiah to cower, to run, to beg. Jeremiah did none of those things. He stood his ground, a pillar of calm in the swirling maelstrom. He let the overseer come to him, using the thick, billowing smoke as a screen. As Finch lunged, swinging the whip, Jeremiah moved. He sidestepped the blow, the leather cracker hissing through the air where his head had been a second before. And as Finch stumbled forward, off balance, Jeremiah swung his heavy club. It was not a wild, panicked swing. It was a calculated, precise blow, aimed not at the man's head, for Jeremiah had no desire to be a murderer, but at his legs. The solid wood connected with Finch's shin with a sickening wet crack that was audible even over the fire's roar. Finch went down with a high, sharp cry of pure pain and shock, clutching his shattered leg. The whip fell from his grasp, landing uselessly in the dirt. By incapacitating Finch, Jeremiah had decapitated the immediate response. The pursuit would be disorganized, delayed. He had bought himself, and more importantly, Ilara, precious, irreplaceable time. He looked down one last time at the writhing form of the overseer, a symbol of the entire broken system, now broken himself, and without a word, he turned and melted back into the thick, choking smoke, leaving Finch to his agony. The legend of Jeremiah Carter was born in those chaotic moments, forged in fire and whispered on the smoke-filled wind. As the enslaved people and the white workers of the plantation scrambled to form bucket brigades or simply stared in horrified awe at the destruction, several of them caught glimpses of a figure moving through the inferno. It was not a man fleeing in terror. The form they saw, distorted by the shimmering heat, haze, and obscured by the thick, rolling clouds of smoke, moved with a strange, calm authority. He was an apparition, a specter born of the flames. One woman, rushing to pull her children back from the dangerous heat, swore she saw a man walking near the very heart of the fire, the flames seeming to part before him as if acknowledging their master. A young field hand, frozen in fear near the tool shed, saw a silhouette move along the edge of the property, not running, but walking with a long, determined stride toward the river. The figure was more than a man. He was a man, shaped shadow, his form indistinct and otherworldly, an impossible presence in a hellscape that should have killed any living thing. The story began to take shape in hushed, fearful whispers passed between the slaves, even as the fire raged. This was not just an escape. This was an ascension. Someone didn't just run. They rose up. They had struck down the overseer, walked through the very fire that was the source of their bondage, and simply vanished. The act of arson was transformed into a mythical event, a moment of supernatural defiance. Jeremiah's individual act of rebellion was becoming a symbol for all of them. The last anyone saw of him was a silhouette, stark and black against the glowing orange-tinted fog and smoke that was now rolling in from the river. He walked toward the water, his form growing less and less distinct, until he was no longer a man, but a smudge of darkness against the glowing mist. And then he was gone. The man of smoke had vanished into the fog. The cold, gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, revealing a scene of utter devastation. The vibrant green of Oakwood Plantation had been scarred by a great black wound, where hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of cotton had stood stacked like pale monuments to wealth. There was now only a field of black, smoking ash. The fire had mostly burned itself out, leaving behind a smoldering, stinking ruin that steamed in the cool morning air. The air, once thick with the sweet scent of cotton, now reeked of char and bitter loss. The master of the plantation, Alistair Dubois, stood at the edge of the devastation, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was a man accustomed to control, to the world bending to his will, and the sight before him was an affront to his very existence. His face, usually a placid mask of aristocratic indifference, was mottled with rage, a vein throbbing visibly in his temple. He had been woken in the night by the hellish glow in the sky, and had arrived from his grand house to witness the final consumption of his fortune. Overseer Finch was brought before him, his face pale and slick with sweat, his leg crudely splinted with 2 pieces of fence post and strips of torn linen. He leaned heavily on 2 other slaves, his usual arrogance replaced by a pathetic, pain-filled grimace. He recounted his version of the night's events, his voice raspy and weak, painting Jeremiah not as a man, but as a demon born of shadow and malice. He described the attack, the calculated blow to his leg, and how he had seen Carter standing by the flames, his face illuminated in a demonic grin. As the fire raged, he was careful to omit his own taunts, his own casual cruelty that had been the spark to the tinder of Jeremiah's rage. He was watching it burn, Master Dubois. Finch rasped, his eyes wide with a mixture of genuine pain and performative fear. Just watching it, like he was proud. And the woman Ilara, she's gone too, vanished from her cabin. They must have planned it together. Dubois's cold eyes shifted from the smoking ruins to Finch's pathetic form, and then to the faces of the other slaves gathered at a distance, their expressions a carefully constructed blend of fear and sorrow. He saw none of the awe, none of the secret triumph that he knew must be flickering in their hearts. The loss of the cotton was a catastrophic financial blow, but the loss of control, the sheer audacity of the rebellion, was an insult that cut far deeper. It was a challenge to the natural order of his world. Find him. Dubois' voice was deceptively soft, a low, venomous hiss that was more terrifying than any shout. Find the boy. And find the woman, Ilara. She's gone too. I want them found. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men, his eyes promising a wrath that would be biblical in its scope. I don't care what it costs. Put the dogs out. Send riders to every crossing, every ferry, every town from here to Vicksburg. I want posters in every settlement. A bounty, a rich one. He turned his gaze back to the smoldering field of his lost wealth. And when you find him, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, I don't want him brought back for whipping. I want Jeremiah Carter's head on a spike, right here, at the edge of this field, as a warning to any other property that forgets its place. The order hung in the cold morning air, a promise of brutal, exemplary vengeance. The official hunt had begun. The full, crushing weight of the system, of the law that protected men like Dubois and condemned men like Jeremiah, was now mobilized. The disappearance of Ilara, now officially linked to Jeremiah's act of defiance, made them partners in crime, 2 fugitives bound together in the eyes of the world that now hunted them. Miles to the north, the world had shrunk to the dense, swampy woods that pressed in on Ilara from all sides. She was terrified. A cold knot of fear lodged deep in her belly, but her terror was a separate thing from her will. Her will was a rod of iron. She moved with a cautious, deliberate grace, her bare feet making almost no sound on the damp, mossy ground. She was using every bit of the survival lore she had gleaned over a lifetime of observation, the whispered knowledge passed down from her mother and grandmother. She listened to the language of the birds, noting their alarm calls, which could signal the approach of a predator or a man. She watched the movement of the squirrels, the flick of a deer's tail. The woods, which had always been a place of potential danger, were now her only sanctuary, a living, breathing entity that could either hide her or betray her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the symphony of the swamp. She thought of Jeremiah, a constant aching presence in her mind. She did not know his fate. She could only pray that the fire had been the cover he needed, that he too was moving through the darkness somewhere, heading north. Her love for him, the memory of his face in the final, fading light of sunset, was the fuel that she burned to keep moving, to put one foot in front of the other. The distant, mournful baying of hounds reached her ears, a sound that sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. They were on her trail, or his. It didn't matter. She knew she had to break her scent trail. She veered from her path, pushing through a thick stand of palmetto bushes until she reached the edge of a slow-moving creek, its water the color of dark tea. Without hesitation, she waded in, the cold water, a shocking embrace around her ankles, then her knees. She moved upstream for half a mile, the mud and water sucking at her legs, the sounds of the dogs growing fainter, more confused. When she finally climbed out onto the opposite bank, shivering and soaked, she felt a flicker of triumph. She had beaten them, for now. She pushed on, her eyes scanning the ground, the trees, searching for the signs Jeremiah had promised her. Doubt began to creep in, a cold, insidious whisper. What if she had missed them? What if the dogs had forced her too far off the path? And then she saw it. At the base of a large cypress tree, almost hidden by a tangle of roots, was a small, deliberate stack of 3 flat stones. It was exactly as he had described it. A surge of hope, so powerful and pure it felt like sunlight breaking through the canopy, flooded her. He had done it. He had marked the path. He was out there, somewhere ahead of her, thinking of her, leading her on. The stones were more than a marker. They were a message. They were his voice, whispering to her across the miles, telling her to be strong, to keep going. She touched the top stone, her fingers tracing its cool, smooth surface. It was a tangible link to him, a promise of a future she could barely dare to imagine. Her resolve hardened. She was not just a runaway, a terrified creature fleeing the whip. She was Ilara, and she was on a journey to her husband and to a life of their own making. Back at Oakwood and on the neighboring plantations, the story of the fire was spreading faster than the flames had. It leaped from quarter to quarter, carried by the mouths of slaves sent on errands, by the gossip of wagon drivers, by the very air itself. But the story that the slaves told each other in hushed, excited whispers was not the one Alistair Dubois was telling. In their version, Jeremiah was not a criminal. He was a hero. He was a force of nature. They spoke of how he had struck down the cruel overseer Finch not with a lucky blow, but with the righteous fury of an avenging angel. They whispered that he had not simply set a fire, but had called it down from the heavens, that he had walked through the very center of the inferno, untouched by the flames. They didn't see him as a man who had run away. They saw him as a ghost who had risen up, a spirit of rebellion made flesh. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to the fact that the system was not invincible, that a single man could make the masters tremble. The legend grew with each telling, embellished with the potent magic of hope and desperation. Old Ben, his back aching and his heart heavy, found himself caught in the currents of this new mythology. He listened as the younger slaves, their eyes bright with a light he hadn't seen in years, spoke of Jeremiah with a breathless awe. They called him the Man of Smoke, the ash walker. They argued about whether he had turned into a hawk and flown away, or dissolved into the river fog itself. Ben felt a complex and unsettling mixture of emotions. He was terrified of the repercussions, of the collective punishment he was sure would fall upon them all. Dubois was not a man to suffer such an insult lightly. Yet, beneath his fear, there was a grudging, undeniable flicker of respect, even pride, for the boy's impossible courage. Jeremiah had done what Ben had spent a lifetime telling himself was impossible. He had stood up straight. He had refused to die a little each day. The legend was already bigger than the man, a powerful idea that could not be captured by dogs or chained by bounties. It was a fire of a different kind, lit in the hearts of the people Jeremiah had left behind, a fire that Dubois, for all his wealth and power, could never extinguish. Jeremiah himself was far from the mythical figure of the stories. He was a man, cold, wet, and terrified. He was hiding in a dense canebrake near a muddy tributary of the Pearl River, the reality of his situation settling upon him like a shroud. He was a fugitive, hunted, alone. He was submerged up to his neck in the murky, stagnant water, the thick stalks of cane forming a dense screen around him. He had been there for hours, his body trembling uncontrollably from a combination of cold and raw primal fear. He had heard them before he saw them, the jingle of harnesses, the low curses of men, the eager panting of dogs. A patrol. He had sunk into the water, holding his breath until his lungs burned, praying that the water would mask his scent. Now, he could hear their voices, terrifyingly close. "Trail goes cold right here at the water," a rough voice said, so near that Jeremiah could hear the man spit. "He's in the river, or he crossed it." "Damn him," another voice replied. "Dubois wants his head. He ain't gonna be happy if we lose him." Jeremiah held his breath, his heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against his ribs. He could see the distorted shapes of the men and their horses through the cane, hear the dogs whining and splashing at the water's edge. This was his first true taste of fear as a hunted man. It was a cold, metallic taste in the back of his throat, a complete and total surrender of the body to the instinct for survival. He thought of the fire, not with regret, but with a grim, chilling understanding of its absolute necessity. It had been a cleansing, a cauterizing of the wound of his past life. He allowed himself one brief, agonizing thought of Ilara. Was she safe? Had she found his signs? The worry was a physical pain, a sharp twisting in his gut. He forced it down, crushing it with the immediate need to survive. He had to live. For her. He had to reach the main river, had to find the next step in the fragile plan he had laid. The patrol lingered for what felt like an eternity, their voices a low murmur of frustration. Finally, with a curse and a sharp command to the dogs, they moved on, their sounds receding down the riverbank. Jeremiah remained submerged, listening, until the only sounds were the buzzing of insects and the gentle lapping of the water against the cane. Only then did he allow himself to rise, gasping, from his watery hiding place. A man reborn into a world of relentless peril. For 2 days, Ilara had been a ghost, a creature of shadow and mist. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her belly, and exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, making every step a monumental effort. She had stumbled upon the farmstead by sheer chance, a small, isolated clearing in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. It was a simple, unpainted house with a sturdy stone chimney, surrounded by neatly tended fields that spoke of hard work and order. A profound wariness, the ingrained instinct of her entire life, told her to retreat back into the safety of the woods. But her desperation, a force more powerful than fear, pushed her forward. She collapsed near the well, her body finally refusing to obey her will. She awoke on a soft straw mattress in a cool, dark space that smelled of earth and apples. A woman with a kind, weathered face and hair the color of spun silver was placing a damp cloth on her forehead. There were no chains, no angry shouts, only a quiet, gentle concern in the woman's pale blue eyes. This was the cellar of the Quaker family, a place known in hushed whispers among the desperate as a potential sanctuary. Hilara was given a bowl of warm stew and a cup of fresh milk, and the simple act of kindness was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. She ate slowly, savoring every mouthful, feeling strength and warmth seep back into her weary limbs. She rested for a full day, hidden away from the world, the rhythmic, peaceful sounds of the farm, a stark contrast to the terror of her journey. Before she left, as the sun began to set on her day of respite, the farmer's wife, whose name she never learned, pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. It contained bread and a piece of hard cheese. "The road ahead is long, child," the woman said, her voice a soft, steady murmur. "The Lord may guide your feet, but you must be wise as a serpent. They are looking for a man of fire, they say, but they will grab any soul they find wandering without a pass. Your journey is north, always north." She leaned closer, her expression serious. "Follow the river, and when you get to the great river, the Mississippi, look for the boatman who sings of Zion. He will know who sent you." The words were a revelation, another piece of Jeremiah's impossible, intricate plan falling into place. He had not just set her on a path, he had arranged for passage, for help. The knowledge was a shield against the fear that threatened to consume her. Ilara nodded, her heart too full for words. She left the farmstead under the cover of twilight, her body rested and her spirit renewed. She had been shown a moment of kindness, a small, flickering candle of humanity in the vast, oppressive darkness of her world, and it gave her the light she needed to continue her perilous journey toward the river and the boatmen who sang of hope. While Ilara found sanctuary, a different kind of man was moving through the same woods, though his purpose was not flight, but the hunt. Alistair Dubois had hired the best. His name was Reed, a relentless slave catcher whose reputation preceded him. Reed was not a man driven by the simple economics of a bounty, though the fortune Dubois offered was substantial. He was a predator who savored the intellectual challenge of the chase, the intricate puzzle of a runaway's mind. He was lean and wiry, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, constantly scanning, analyzing, and deducing. Where other patrols had been confounded by Jeremiah's water crossing and careful movements, Reed saw a pattern. He was not tracking a panicked animal. He was tracking an intelligence, an opponent worthy of his skills. He found the place where Jeremiah had hidden in the canebrake, noting the single, almost invisible broken reed that marked a hasty exit. But it was deeper in the woods, where Reed found the clue that made him smile. A thin, cold stretching of his lips. It was a campsite, if one could call it that. There was no fire pit, no discarded food, nothing a normal patrol would ever notice. But Reed saw the faint impression in the leaves where a man had lain, and he saw how the branches of a low bush had been deliberately tied back with a blade of grass to create a sight line to the path below, then released to spring back into place. This was not the work of a man running blind. This was the work of a man who was watching his back trail, a man who was hunting his hunters. "He's clever," Reed said to one of his men, a brutish individual who relied on dogs and fear. "He's not just running from us. He's thinking. He's moving with a purpose." This realization elevated the chase for Reed. It was no longer a simple matter of pursuit and capture. It had become a personal duel, a battle of wits played out across the swamps and forests of Mississippi. Reed felt a thrill, a surge of adrenaline that was his true reward. He would not be outsmarted. He would find this man of smoke and ash, and he would drag him back in chains, not just for Dubois' money, but for the satisfaction of proving he was the superior mind, the ultimate hunter. He picked up Jeremiah's trail with a renewed and dangerous focus. A wolf who had scented not just blood, but a worthy adversary. Jeremiah lay entombed in the hollow of an ancient cypress tree, a space that was both a tomb and a womb. The darkness was absolute, thick and suffocating, smelling of damp wood and decay. He had squeezed himself into the tight space at dawn, seeking refuge from the daylight that would expose him. Here, forced into stillness, his mind began to work. The adrenaline that had fueled him for days had finally burned away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the cold, heavy weight of his thoughts. He saw the faces of those he had left behind at Oakwood. He saw Ilara, her eyes full of love and fear, and he saw old Ben, his face a mask of sorrowful wisdom, his voice echoing in Jeremiah's memory, warning him of the storm he was about to unleash. A pang of guilt, sharp and debilitating, pierced through him. Had he brought ruin upon them? Would Dubois's wrath fall on the innocent, a collective punishment for his act of defiance? He wrestled with the question, the darkness of the hollow amplifying the darkness in his own soul. He had to believe he had done the right thing. He had to believe that freedom for any of them was a victory for all of them, that a single spark of rebellion was better than a lifetime of quiet submission. He steeled himself with the conviction that he had not just been destroying, but creating a possibility, a legend that might give others the courage to stand up straight. He was caught in a strange limbo, a man between two worlds. He was no longer Jeremiah Carter, slave. That man had burned to ash with the cotton, but he was not yet a free man. He was a ghost, a fugitive, a whisper on the wind. His very identity felt as formless as the smoke he had disappeared into. He had no name, no place, nothing but the rags on his back and the desperate burning hope in his heart. And that hope had a name, Ilara. He clung to the thought of her, his mind tracing the path he had marked, praying she had found the signs, that she was safe, that she was moving north. The thought of their reunion was the only thing that kept the encroaching despair at bay. It was his North Star in the suffocating darkness of the Cypress Hollow, the one point of light in a universe of fear. He was not just running for himself. He was running toward her, and that single powerful truth was all the identity he needed. The near miss happened at a small, unmanned ferry crossing on the Bogue Chitto River. It was a moonless night, the sky a black velvet canopy pricked with the cold, distant light of stars. Jeremiah had been moving for hours, his hunger a gnawing beast in his belly. He had lost his small pouch of provisions somewhere in the swamp, and his strength was failing. The ferry was a simple flat-bottomed raft, tethered to a post on the near bank. His plan was to untie it, use the pole to guide it across the slow-moving current, and then let it drift downstream, covering his tracks. He moved out of the tree line, his senses on high alert. The air was still. The only sound, the gentle lapping of the river against the bank and the chirping of crickets. He was halfway to the ferry when he heard it, the one sound he had been dreading, the low, eager whine of a hound. He froze, his body instantly rigid. Then he heard the jingle of a harness and the low murmur of voices from the opposite bank. A patrol. They were waiting for him. He saw the flare of a match as one of the men lit a pipe, and in that brief flickering light, he saw the face of his hunter. It was Reed. The man was leaning against a tree, his posture relaxed, but his gaze was fixed on the ferry crossing, a patient predator waiting for his prey to step into the trap. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Jeremiah. They had anticipated him. Reed had outthought him. He had to run, but there was nowhere to go. The woods behind him would be full of their dogs. The river was his only chance. Without another thought, he abandoned his plan and scrambled down the muddy bank, plunging into the dark, shockingly cold water. The current was faster than it looked, and it grabbed him, pulling him under. He fought his way to the surface, gasping for air, his lungs burning. On the bank, the dog began to bark frantically. Shouts erupted from the far side of the river. There, in the water. A gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet whining past his head and splashing into the water just inches away. Jeremiah didn't swim. He surrendered, letting the powerful current carry him downstream, away from the lights and the shouts, deeper into the darkness. He was colder, hungrier, and more vulnerable than ever before, but he was alive, and now, the chase was no longer an abstract concept. It was personal. He had seen the face of his hunter, and he knew the man was close, a relentless shadow that would not stop until one of them was finished. The Mississippi River was not a river. It was a presence, a vast, moving darkness that breathed a cold, wet breath into the night. Jeremiah, weakened but alive, finally reached its banks at a specific secluded bend, miles north of Natchez, a place he had only ever seen in his mind's eye. He was a ruin of a man, his clothes in tatters, his body a canvas of scratches and bruises from his desperate flight through the wilderness. The plunge into the bog Chido had saved him from Reed's trap, but it had stolen the last of his meager strength, leaving him shivering and hollowed out. Yet, he had kept moving, driven by a force more powerful than hunger or exhaustion. The image of Ilara's face, a burning ember in the cold darkness of his mind. Now, he stood at the edge of the great river, the rendezvous point, and a thick, spectral fog was rolling in off the water. It was a living thing, a silent white wall that swallowed the trees, the riverbank, and the world itself. It was both a danger and a potential savior, a shroud that could hide him from his pursuers or conceal unknown threats. He listened, his nerves stretched taut, every fiber of his being attuned to the sounds of the night. The air was unnervingly still, the usual chorus of insects and frogs muffled by the dense vapor. He could hear his own ragged breathing and the frantic, unsteady beat of his own heart. This was it, the final gamble. He knew Reed could not be far behind. The man was too clever, too relentless. He was a shadow clinging to Jeremiah's heels, and his proximity was a cold pressure at the back of Jeremiah's neck. Taking a shaky breath, he cupped his hands to his mouth and released the call he and Alara had practiced in whispered tones so long ago, the mournful, three-note cry of a whippoorwill. The sound was thin and fragile, and the fog seemed to snatch it from the air, smothering it almost instantly. He waited. The silence that answered was absolute, profound, and terrifying. He waited for what felt like an eternity, a lifetime passing in each suspended second. Doubt, a cold and venomous serpent, began to coil in his gut. Had he been wrong? Was the Quaker woman's information faulty? Had the boatman been captured? Or worse, was he alone, at the end of his strength, waiting for the inevitable sound of dogs and men crashing through the undergrowth? The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. The fog swirled around him, its damp tendrils clinging to his skin like ghostly fingers, creating a sense of profound mystery and unreality. He was about to call out again, a desperate, foolish act, when he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he had imagined it, the gentle, rhythmic dip of a single oar in the water. A shape began to resolve itself out of the white wall of fog. It was a small skiff, moving with an impossible silence, a ghost ship on a ghostly river. A lone figure stood in the stern, poling the boat forward with long, powerful, silent strokes. The man was a silhouette, his features obscured by the mist and the darkness, but Jeremiah could feel his cautious, assessing gaze. The skiff glided to a stop a few feet from the bank, its hull scraping softly against the mud. The boatman was a free black man, his face grim and deeply lined, his eyes holding the weary caution of a man who trafficked in dangerous secrets. He did not speak for a long moment, his gaze sweeping the shoreline, listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble, barely louder than a whisper. "You the one who walks through fire?" The question hung in the foggy air, a password spoken between two worlds. Jeremiah's throat was raw, his voice a dry, hoarse croak. He had to swallow twice before he could answer. "I'm the one looking for his wife." The boatman nodded slowly. A single, decisive movement. The grim lines of his face seemed to soften almost imperceptibly. "She's waiting on the other side," he said, his voice still low, but now carrying a different tone, a note of confirmation, of mission. "Got here 2 days ago, scared, but strong. Said a man of smoke and ash would be coming for her." He gestured with his head toward the skiff. "Get in. The dogs are close. I heard them a mile back, crying like they lost the scent at the river's edge. But they'll be casting a wide net." The words struck Jeremiah with the force of a physical blow. Ilara. She was safe. She had made it. She was waiting for him. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming. It was like a dam breaking inside him. The terror and tension that had held him together for days, the iron bands of adrenaline and fear, simply dissolved, leaving him boneless and weak. His knees buckled, and he had to catch himself on a tree to keep from collapsing. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in his eyes, blurring the ghostly image of the boat and the boatman. He had done it. His impossible plan, woven from desperation and hope, had worked. The two halves of their escape were coming together. The knowledge was a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, a final, desperate burst of strength that propelled him forward. He stumbled down the muddy bank and waded into the cold water, his hands reaching for the side of the skiff. Just as Jeremiah's hands gripped the gunwale of the boat, a shout erupted from the woods behind him, sharp and clear in the night. There, by the water, lights appeared, the bobbing, dancing flames of pine, not torches cutting through the fog. Reed, he had found him. The slave catcher and his men crashed through the undergrowth onto the riverbank, their dark forms silhouetted against the torchlight. The dogs, having finally found the scent, began to bark with a frantic, savage intensity. "In the boat!" Reed's voice roared, filled with the fury of a predator whose prey was slipping from his grasp. "Don't let him get away! Fire!" The night exploded in a cacophony of violence. Gunshots cracked, the flashes of orange from the muzzles piercing the fog. The reports were muffled, the sound strangely deadened by the thick, wet air. Bullets whined past them, splashing into the water with angry hisses, sending up small geysers of black water around the skiff. Jeremiah scrambled over the side, collapsing into the bottom of the boat as the boatman dug his pole deep into the muddy riverbed. With a powerful, desperate shove, he pushed the skiff away from the bank and out into the main current. The boatman grabbed his oars, dropping them into the oarlocks with a practiced, fluid motion, and began to row. He did not pull with frantic haste, but with long, deep, silent strokes, his body a machine of controlled power, pulling the skiff further and further into the dense, white sanctuary of the fog. From the shore, the scene became a chaotic, distorted tableau. Reed and his men fired again and again, their shots wild and directionless, their curses swallowed by the immense, indifferent mist. They could see the shadow of the skiff for a moment, a dark shape with two figures, and then it began to dissolve, its edges blurring, its form becoming less and less distinct until it was completely consumed by the white wall of the fog. The man of smoke had now vanished into the mist. Reed stood on the riverbank, listening to the frantic, useless barking of his dogs, staring into the blank whiteness that had swallowed his quarry. He had been beaten. The man was gone. The journey across the river was a passage between worlds. Inside the cocoon of fog, the chaos of the riverbank faded, replaced by a profound and surreal silence, broken only by the quiet, rhythmic splash of the oars. Jeremiah lay in the bottom of the skiff, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and the deep, shuddering release of his relief. He was brought to a small, unassuming house nestled in a grove of trees in a settlement of free people of color on the other side of the river. It was a safe house, a haven. He was led into a small, clean room, lit by the soft, warm glow of a single candle. And there, standing by the hearth, her back to him, was Ilara. She turned as he entered, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other across the small space. She was thinner, her face etched with the lines of fear and exhaustion, but her eyes, her beautiful, strong eyes, shone with a light that eclipsed the candlelight. There were no grand speeches, no soaring declarations. Words were useless, inadequate vessels for the ocean of emotion that surged between them. They moved at the same time, rushing into each other's arms. A collision of desperation and homecoming. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, the one true, grounding scent in his entire universe. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the tattered fabric of his shirt, her body trembling against his. It was a quiet, profound moment of release, the silent, powerful confirmation of their survival, their reunion. They held each other for a long time, two halves of a single soul made whole again. The scars of their journey, both visible and invisible, were there, but so was the unbreakable, undeniable strength of their bond. Their future was a vast, terrifying unknown, a path stretching into a new kind of darkness, but they would walk it together. It was their own. Months later, back in Natchez, the autumn rains had washed the last of the black ash from the ground at Oakwood Plantation, but the scar on the land and on the fortune of Alistair Dubois remained. He never recovered his loss. The fire had broken something in him, not just his bank account, but his belief in the unshakable order of his world. He became a bitter, withdrawn man, haunted by the ghost of a slave he could not capture. Reed, the great hunter, never caught his man. He returned to Dubois empty-handed, his reputation tarnished, his pride shattered by the man who had dissolved into smoke and fog. The story of Jeremiah Carter, however, did not fade. It grew. It became a permanent legend, a piece of the secret folklore of the enslaved. It was told in hushed, reverent whispers in the quarters on cold winter nights, a story of defiance that gave hope to the hopeless. The man himself was gone, vanished from the face of the earth. But the shadow man, the man of fire and fog, remained. He became a powerful symbol of rebellion, a ghost of freedom haunting the edges of the plantation world, a promise that chains could be broken, that masters could be defied, that a man could, if his will was strong enough, walk through the fire and be reborn. Some fires, once they are lit, can never truly be extinguished.